Good morning, everyone. Plenty of good seats up front if you're looking for one. There's even a table that's totally open. Welcome to everybody watching on the live stream as well. So this is session 2 of The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. Margaret has just made an entrance, and we're both ready to go. So last week, if you were here or if you saw the recording or watched on the live stream, we talking about the Older Testament, and today we're going to now start talking about the Older Testament. We're going to move from last week's kind of big overview, what kind of book are we even talking about, to now really doing what we're going to try to do every week going forward, which is to start walking through the Older Testament. We're going to start at least in order of the books as they appear until we get to around Advent, and then we're going to start jumping around a bit, but we'll explain that when we get there. Mostly because the first, 5, 6, 7 books of the Older Testament essentially tell a connected story. We begin today, a book of Genesis, at the beginning of the universe. It's kind of a dramatic way to start your book, and then eventually the story's focus will narrow and we'll follow a single family for a while, which will turn into a nation, and then it gets really complicated, but it'll be also a lot of fun. As we get started, though, a couple of quick announcements. You have a bonus announcement that's not on the slide, which is an early reminder about the Twin Cities Marathon next Sunday. So know your commute. I don't know the route. I will not be running in the marathon. I won't even be watching the marathon because it would make me tired. But if you're coming for this, just plan accordingly, come early, check online to see how you can get here. We have an interview with Anna Carter-Florence that is online now at the Adult Ed website, where she talks with Margaret and myself about Genesis 1 through 24. Back in the day, Anna was an associate pastor here at Westminster. She's now a professor of homiletics or preaching at a Presbyterian seminary in Decatur, Georgia. And she's brilliant. She understands story. She understands biblical interpretation and memory. So I commend that half-hour video to you. Also, if you're interested, if today's not enough for you and you want to dig deeper into these texts and these topics, Margaret and I will be, we're co-hosting this week in the Meisel room, kind of the other side of the building, from 6:45 to 8. That will also be offered hybrid or simulcast, on Zoom, so you can participate online or in the room. One of our goals is no question is too basic or no question is too rudimentary. We had a lot of questions last Wednesday with the folks who participated. We'll have more this week, I'm sure. And we're going to try to keep the focus mostly on Genesis 1 through 24, but, like I said, any questions are welcome. So plan for that. Also, one more announcement. Wednesday at 3 in the afternoon, Rodney is hosting an informal conversation with the artist Hu, who painted this. And you're probably familiar with this style. I think it's fair to say, this is, in my mind, he's the most famous Chinese Christian painter working today. And you're going to say, well, who's your second favorite or second? I'd have to think about that. But I know him because he's so prolific, and I think he's so creative, and we have so much of his work here at Westminster. He used to live in the Twin Cities and is known to a lot of people around here. So if you're interested in his work, come Wednesday, 3 o'clock in the Great Hall. More on that. Those are all the details I know about that. So when we're starting in Genesis, which literally means, the beginning, Jews refer to this book as Bereshit, which just means in the beginning. It's the first word of the book in Hebrew. It's a story about origins, and origins matter to us in all sorts of ways. We don't think that they do, but we have a way of holding on to origin stories in our families, sometimes in our neighborhoods, certainly in our nations. And so just a couple of images here that can reflect our curiosity with our origins. With the advent of the Webb telescope, who knows what we're going to be learning about the origins of the universe in the years to come. The photo there from the Library of Congress, probably hard to see in the back, a ship full of immigrants about to dock at Ellis Island. A lot of us have stories about families that either migrated to this country or perhaps have always been in this country. And so that's another way we talk about who we are, how we got here, where we're from. My family has an origin story that involves, I kid you not, I grew up in Northern California. We didn't think anything existed east of Lake Tahoe when I grew up. I have an origin story about a great-grandfather named Olaf, who was a lutefisk importer in Chicago. So, who was kind of the first generation on my mother's side of the family. Then I moved here, and everybody's like, "Oh, I think we might have the same grandfather." There's a lot of those stories in Minnesota. So families have origin stories, and nations, of course, have origin stories. And some of those are sanitized stories. Think of the story you might have been taught about the first Thanksgiving, for example, or something like that, which is a moving story, an important story, but probably not the whole story. Right? Even looking at this photo, African Americans have very different origin stories about how their families got to this country. Very different kinds of ships, very different kinds of travel. So origin stories are particular. In some ways we agree on them, maybe as a nation or maybe as a church. We think about what's our origin story here. It's an auspicious time for Tim to walk out the back doors. I talk about Westminster's origin story and the pastors who are here and the families who started the church. Before we jump into Genesis, then I want to talk a little bit about that. And so I want to invite us at our tables, just in groups of maybe 2 or 3, find a stranger who looks relatively approachable, and think, if you can, of maybe a national origin story. How did we get here? Why are we like this? Interpret we however you want. Think of an origin story about your family. What's a story that your family tells about how you came to be, or who did something either tragic or heroic or something that had an effect in your family? And maybe an origin story about the human condition. Genesis will have stories to tell about the human condition. Where did sin come from? Right? Why do we have knowledge of our mortality, the knowledge of good and evil, the story about Adam and Eve in the garden? We have other origin stories that we tell about how we got there. So anyway, just take 5 minutes. If you can, think of a family origin story, a national origin story, and a human condition origin story. It doesn't have to be one that you like, but one that you've heard. Does that make sense? And folks online, you are welcome to put this in the chat if you want. Just kind of share what comes to mind and even respond to each other in the chat. Are we good on the audio? I'm going to call us back together. I do see one chair up front, and I know more chairs are on their way, or some in the back. We also have some room up front if we need to move chairs up here, too. I apologize for the cramped conditions. So Margaret has a microphone. I just want to take maybe 2 or 3 bits of information and just kind of hear if you have an observation from something that somebody at your table said about what makes these kinds of stories similar or different, whether it's national or whether it's familial or family story or a story about kind of the human condition. We know that there's usually a bit of a mixture of truth and fantasy in some of these stories. But Marg.
Yeah, the common thing was place. Where did we originate? Where did the country originate?
Yeah, and so even for the country, places like this is where this happened, or
this is where it started.
Where it started, yeah. Place matters. Anyone else?
Our common factor was that nothing changes and everything changes, that humans are different in different cultures, but the basic human conditions continue, both our strengths and our weaknesses, our brutality and our humanity.
Interesting.
I was impressed that 2 out of the 3 stories that were shared at this table revealed that what was thought to be true was not, in fact, true about the origin stories.
Yeah.
And I think we keep learning that every day.
Yeah. I might push back and say, what does it mean for a story like that to be true, right? Is there a difference between historical exactitude, right? This is exactly what was spoken on this spot versus maybe this says something about the human condition. I had a teacher once who said, you can learn more about the human condition from reading War and Peace than you can from reading the lives of the celebrities in People magazine, right? The lives of the celebrity might be true, but how much is that really going to reveal the depths of the human condition? I'm going to move on and take us to Genesis then in particularity. We're looking at Genesis 1 through 24. This is a chapter with 50 books. So we're going to have to fly high for a little bit. I want to give a brief overview of what happens in this book. Obviously, we don't have time to settle into all of it, but we can split this essentially into 2 parts. Genesis 1 through 11 is often referred to as the primeval history. That sounds like a weird expression. You'll understand more shortly. Genesis 12 through 24, the story starts to narrow and focuses on a single family, and that happens with someone you might have heard of, Abraham and his wife Sarah. And I don't know why it's called the Abraham cycle. There's nothing particularly round about it or anything like that. But the narrative follows Abraham and Sarah almost exclusively for a number of chapters. And then, as we'll see next week when Margaret's teaching, we start to follow their progeny, right? Their sons and daughters-in-law and so on. So I want to give just a real quick run, literally a run through this primeval history. Like, what's primeval about it? In many ways, these are texts, or stories that appear to be more myth than anything else. They have a mythical sense to them, similar to if you've studied Greek or Roman mythology or mythology from other cultures as well. Ways in which stories like this tend to be designed to explain where something came from or how something first happened. And so we have creation stories in Genesis. It starts with the 6-day creation. We'll come back to this in just a minute, but you might be familiar with this, where God speaks and something comes into being. There's a second creation story in Genesis chapter 2 where creation happens in a place, right? This is where it's in a garden, and it's a different kind of style of a story where we get more of a hands-on God, a God who's creating things out of the stuff of the earth. The serpent and the expulsion, you might know this story as well, sometimes referred to as the fall. I'm not sure that's the best title for it, but this is where the first humans eat the so-called forbidden fruit, tempted by a serpent, and are expelled from the Garden of Eden as a result. In many ways, a story meant to describe things like where does sin come from? Why is gardening so difficult? And why does childbirth hurt so much, right? There's a way in which the story, those things, which you could imagine people asking, gets this kind of mythological grounding in an original story. Then we get the first murder. So interesting. Just after the expulsion, you get the first act of violence, human versus human. And you also get the first story of two brothers in Genesis. There are going to be a lot of brother stories in this book about brothers who fight, brothers who can't get along, brothers who think the world isn't big enough or God's promises aren't big enough for all of them. And so in this tragedy, Cain murders his brother Abel, not for no reason, maybe not for a good reason, but because they both offer sacrifices. Cain is a farmer, Abel is a herder, and God accepts Abel's sacrifice but does not look kindly on Cain's sacrifice for reasons that aren't explained. This makes Cain jealous, and he kills his brother and then is banished as a result. So you've also got in this story a bit of the rivalry between herders and farmers. I grew up in the suburbs, surrounded by asphalt. I don't quite know what that means, but you can imagine, right? Fighting over land, right? What's cultivated in different places, whose animals get to roam and eat whatever they want, who has a more kind of orderly setup. Then everything just falls apart, and we get a couple of chapters talking about the depravity of humanity, and then God tells Noah to build an ark. There's a flood. I'm assuming you know this story. God wipes out all the inhabitants of the earth except for one family and the animals they're able to save. And then God makes a covenant. God makes a promise never to destroy the earth again in this way, and gives a sign, which is the rainbow, right? So again, stories about what will God do to a sinful humanity? What about second chances? Where do rainbows come from? Then we get proliferation of nations. Where do all the nations come from? And it's like, whose children go off and found different nations? And so the story here of why are people different? Why do they speak a different language? Why do they have different kind of cultural practices over there? Get traced back to the children of Noah. The Tower of Babel story, which you might know. Why are there so many different languages? Why are there so many different cultures? Well, God scatters everybody because God is concerned about this tower they are building to the heavens. You see why all of this has a mythical element to it, right? These are stories meant to talk about where do certain aspects of the human condition come from. I think it's better to read these as myth than as quote-unquote literal history. Doesn't mean they don't still have truth in them. The other things about these stories is they all have ways of becoming archetypes. You know what I mean? The creation story has probably forever, right, had an archetypical aspect to it, especially when it comes to things like Adam being made first in Genesis 2, Eve being created second in that same story. Other biblical authors even play on that and talk about one being created first, implying a kind of dominance or a preeminence over the other. Similar with the story of eating the forbidden fruit in the garden, right? Whose quote-unquote fault is that? A lot of history of interpretation has said, has taken the story as a warning to men about the wiles of women and their susceptibility, right? Funny, but of course also not funny, in the way that these stories have become kind of these types to describe what does it mean to be male, what does it mean to be female, what does it mean to be human. More on that in just a little bit. All of these stories also, at least almost all of these stories, feature God as an active participant in what's going on. God as a character, an active force in these stories, which means these stories also offer characterizations about who God is. Like, what does God do? What is God like? Is God trustworthy? These kinds of basic questions, which means the power of these stories, the mythical power of these stories to shape an imagination about what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to live in community, who is God and how do we know God, is incredibly powerful, just like our origin stories in a lot of ways in our families and our nations can be as well. Some of these stories are horrific, too, in their own right, of course, right? And I'm sure many people have stories about how Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, the creation in the garden in particular, and the the fall, the so-called fall of humanity, has been important. The Noah story raises all kinds of ethical questions that are rightly disturbing. I don't want to gloss over those, but I want to note that and say if you want to talk about those more, Wednesday night could be a great time to do that, for one thing. And also the interview with Anna Carter Florence goes a little bit deeper into those as well. Oh, I almost forgot. Primeval history ends with mention of a particular family, a man named Terah, who settles in Haran, and along with him are his son, one of his sons, Abram, and his daughter-in-law, Sarai. Now, this is the introduction to this family who's going to become so prominent going forward in Genesis. We'll talk about Haran in just a second. So this is the transition now into the Abraham and the Sarah cycle in Genesis 12 through 24. In the back, by the door, just next to Beth Hart Anderson, are some handouts, if you didn't get any last week, including a massive timeline that Michael Gold, who's our admin and colleague here at Westminster, I almost said drew up, composed for us. And this is taken from the very beginning. This is the first line of the timeline, which is roughly 2000 to 1500 before the Common Era, right? What we used to call before Christ. Picks up the story of Abraham. You'll notice we did not put on the timeline Genesis 1 through 11, because that just seems to exist almost outside of time and space.
6,000 years ago, Matt.
Oh, sorry.
No.
There you go. Thank you, Margaret. Any questions about the young Earth theory? Margaret is here for those. You totally threw me. That was funny. No, it's all good. So, as the Bible puts it, at least, following the Bible's dating and tracking the ages of all of these people and so on, roughly this time period describes Abraham arriving in Canaan, the birth of Isaac. Next week we'll get to Jacob and Joseph as well. You'll notice on the other side, who rules the Holy Land? Well, it's not so simple. There are the various city-states that are there, and there's some Egyptian presence in the Holy Land. Books that take place during this period, Genesis. Books written during this period, NA. In other words, when was Genesis written down? There's nobody who believes it's written down by the people who are experiencing this. And if you were to look at the timeline even further down, the best hypotheses of biblical scholars would say that the book of Genesis, along with some other writings, was not written down until about probably the 6th or 5th century BCE, or before Christ. And it's written down probably during or just after a time when the inhabitants of the land, the nation, when the nation of Judah has been brought into exile, right? They've been forcibly deported to a foreign land to work there, but also in many ways to break their culture. Nevertheless, they still survive. They hold on to the faith of their ancestors. Eventually, when the empires turn over and the Persians are in charge, they're allowed to return home and literally rebuild a nation, rebuild their cities, rebuild their farms, rebuild a temple. And it's during that period, we think, that the book of Genesis, as well as several that follow, was actually put into written form. Not saying it was all necessarily invented then. They probably are drawing from stories that are already in circulation, but this is when it's written down. What is significant about this, and I bring this up because Anna Carter Florence mentions this in her video, is one of the things that I think is helpful when we're reading these stories, which are good, bad, uncanny, morally complicated at times, is to recognize they come out of the imagination, they come out of the memory, they come out of the self-identity work of people who have experienced tremendous suffering, people who have experienced dislocation, people who are trying to manage relocation and all that comes from that, people who have suffered humiliation, religious humiliation, political humiliation, military humiliation, and are trying to reckon with the reality that they've survived somehow, and their ancestors survived somehow, and they're now able to rebuild this sense of a nation and this identity. And they go back to write or collect these stories and tell them in a way that sometimes is very triumphant, look at all the good stuff we did, but also sometimes is brutally honest about some of the shortcomings of these main characters, which is worth noting. We sometimes read these and think, did the ancient people realize how scary the story of Noah was? And I think they must have at one level. Do they realize that the story of Abraham almost sacrificing his child is a horrific story? I do think that they might have as well. I don't think we're the first people who are somehow morally sophisticated enough to recognize this. So there's something about noting the ways in which the memories of this nation, the origin stories of this nation, comes out of this experience of profound suffering and loss. So hold on to that for now, and I think we'll come back to it as well. Mark, you talked about place. Where is all of this taking place? Where is all of this going on? This is also on our website. Here's a map that Michael created for us. This is the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, right there. Haran, Abraham, that family, they're up in what's modern Turkey. Wandering around up there, not entirely wandering, they settle in a place called Haran, and eventually they're on their way to the land of Canaan, which we now refer to Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land, the Levant, has a dozen different names that we might give it. To see more of a close-up of this spot, some of these names get mentioned in the story of Abraham and Sarah. Beersheba gets mentioned, Mamre gets mentioned. Some of these places along the Dead Sea get mentioned. They also go down to Egypt, which is down here on the floor, or over there. So again, this is it's a time when people are Bedouins. It's a time of people who, in rather large clans, as best we can tell, migrate. They migrate so that they can their animals can feed. They migrate to trade. Sometimes they migrate to stay alive in a land that's not always very arable, right? And I can't always rely on cultivating the land. What happens in this story then with these people? Again, now we're going to go kind of quickly, right? Again, what happens in chapters 12 through 24? God breaks in, as God often does in the book of Genesis, and chooses Abraham, or Abram, he's called at that time, for no apparent reason, and says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Abram this time is 75 years old, and God says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Promises land, promises descendants. Then we're told that Abram and Sarai worked their way down to Egypt. Abram has left his father's clan. We think that's normal in the United States, right? You turn 18, you leave your parents' house and go make your millions and come back, or whatever happens in that American dream story. To leave your clan in the ancient world was incredibly risky. These clans were essentially, and the leaders of these clans, what we would call today warlords. I mean, these are people who travel in groups. They're armed. They're kind of their own mobile nations, as best we can tell. Abram and Sarai venture out, not on their own. They probably take a host of people with them, but they end up in Egypt, where Abram does the rather unnoble thing, which is he passes off his wife as a sister because she's beautiful, and he's afraid that he's going to be killed as a result. This is the one who's just been told he's going to give birth to a nation, right? And he does that. Come back to that. He has a nephew named Lot who gets into trouble. Abram has to go save him. How's that for a really quick story? God shows up again and cuts a covenant. This is the actual verb that Hebrew uses for making a covenant. Cuts a covenant with Abram, kind of reiterates the promise, and there's this ceremony where Abram falls asleep after cutting a bunch of animals in half, and a torch walks or travels between the cut animals to symbolize the presence of God. It was a way in which ancient societies used to make kind of agreements between different states or different clans, and God enacts this covenant, this promise to Abram. Interesting, Abram sleeps through the whole thing, right? Because God makes the covenant with God's own self. It's not like they're two equal partners that are engaged here, but God says, this is what I'm going to do with you. At this time, he still is childless. Then he has a son. Sarai and Hagar decide, look, it's just not working for us. We're getting old. And so the suggestion is that Abram should have a child with one of Hagar's enslaved people, who's also Egyptian. So notice the way Egypt is also figuring into the story so far. And so Abram's firstborn son is named Ishmael. God then institutes circumcision, like this is how people are going to know you're my people, right? All the males shall have their foreskins removed. God tells Abram and Sarai to take on new names, Abraham and Sarah. During this time, Abram too is like, it'd be great if this Ishmael could inherit the promise. That's great. I like Ishmael, all fine. And God keeps saying, no, the promise is going to come through Sarah. Abraham thinks this is hilarious. Sarah thinks this is hilarious, right, given their ages. But God keeps doing this. So what I want you to notice is the way in which God keeps coming back and reiterating promises. But also one of the themes that shows up is the threat. There's always this threat to the promise. Sometimes the threat is, oh my goodness, we're in Egypt and the Pharaoh's going to want to take Sarai into his own harem. Sometimes it's Lot's an idiot and he's going to get us all killed. Sometimes it's is the promise through Ishmael and Hagar going to be quote unquote legitimate, or is it not? All of these things are part of what's going on, and there's a kind of patience, faithfulness, and cunning that all get mixed together in a lot of these stories. The story of Sodom then shows up, which you might know, which has a story that has, I think, a horrible afterlife in terms of how it's been used. This is a story I think that's less about what we would less about what we would call homosexuality today, to use a term that doesn't really apply in the ancient world in the same way. But rather, this is a story about a lack of hospitality. This is a story about violence against guests in one's home. We can talk about that more on Wednesday if we want. We could spend 3 hours talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, but we're not going to pause at every horrific story. Even beyond how this story has been interpreted for a lot of anti-gay kind of theology or ideology, is the idea of God wiping out a city as well. Let's not just forget that. Before that happens, though, it's interesting. One of the things that Abraham does is he bargains with God. He's like, do you really want to destroy Sodom? And God's like, I really want to destroy Sodom. And Abraham's like, what if we can find like 100 righteous people in Sodom? Would you still destroy it? God's like, no, I wouldn't do it for 100. And Abraham's like, what if we find maybe like 50? Like, would you destroy Sodom then? And God's like, nah, I wouldn't do it for you. And so Abraham bargains God down, so to speak, which is also an interesting part of God's characterization, that God isn't this otherworldly tyrant, right? But Abraham's able to go back and forth, right, and work this out and talk God out of certain things. Moses will do similar things in the book of Exodus as well. Then Abraham and Sarah end up with a guy named Abimelech, a foreign king, and guess what Abraham does? He says, oh no, she's my sister. You can have her if you want. So once again, you're like, didn't we already read this like chapters ago? There's this way that stories repeat in this, and you think, does nobody learn their lesson in the book of Genesis? And what in the world is the matter with Abraham that he keeps on doing this? Again, it's funny, but of course it's also not funny. There's a way in which Abraham is trafficking his wife, is fair to say. And of course, we read this knowing the bigger story, knowing how it's supposed to end, and we think, right, this is all endangering the promise. Right? The promise is endangered at every step in Genesis. How is this ever going to work out? Lo and behold, Isaac is born, the so-called child of the promise. This creates problems because now Abraham lives in a household with 2 sons, 2 different mothers, one enslaved, one is his wife. And so Ishmael and Isaac have either disagreements of some kind, or Ishmael teases Isaac. It's not clear, but Sarah perceives that the children aren't getting along, and Sarah talks Abraham into banishing Hagar and Ishmael. And it's this awful story of them being sent out. Hagar puts Ishmael under a bush and walks away because she can't bear to watch him die in the wilderness. God then appears to Hagar, the enslaved Egyptian woman, and makes a promise to her, makes a covenant to her about Ishmael becoming a great nation. They then disappear from the story from that point on. It's one of these points where I had an Old Testament professor who liked to say, never forget God has other stories. Right? Genesis follows its main plot line, but occasionally other characters come in and out of the story, and occasionally we get hints of them having a broader story that also has great significance. So never forget that God makes a promise to Ishmael in the book of Genesis as well, to be a great nation. This is a story that has had all sorts of I think, value in a lot of recent interpretation, especially around some African-American biblical interpreters who talk about Ishmael, or talk about Hagar as an Egyptian in particular, and what does this mean? Hagar is the first woman to name God in the Bible, gives God a name, calls him El Roi, and refers to God as the one who sees, right? God sees Hagar and Ishmael in their suffering, in the injustice that they've suffered. So again, a horrific story, a story that also has some redemptive aspects in it, if we dig around. Speaking of a horrific story, the binding of Isaac. God says to Abraham, show me how much you love me, show me how faithful you are, and go and kill your son on the mountain I've shown you. Which after chapter after chapter after chapter, right, of is there or isn't there going to be an heir, we get this. More on that in just a minute. Sarah's death is recounted. Isaac, their son, marries Rebekah in a rather entertaining story that you want to read your children about how people find wives in the ancient world, basically hanging out at a well and bartering until you can arrange a marriage. Not how I would recommend doing it, but it works for some cultures. Isaac marries Rebekah, and then we'll pick up next week. A lot going on there. What I wanted to highlight is stories, of course, that strike us as good, stories that strike us as bad, stories that strike us as a little bit uncanny and hard to figure out. But in the time we have left, I want to highlight a couple of quick things with us. And one is the way in which God keeps showing up in these stories. And I've mentioned this, that God is in many ways a character in some of these stories. And that really happens from the outset, where God gets characterized by what God does, what God says. And the book of Genesis is not utterly consistent in how it characterizes God. So if you're looking for a God who always acts the same in every single circumstance, Genesis might not be the book for you. This comes at the very beginning. Genesis chapter 1, I said there's a creation story over 6 days. Anybody remember how it goes? What's the opening line? For God, in the beginning, when God started creating the heavens and the earth, different ways of translating that, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And this is a pattern that shows up, right? God says, let there be, something happens. Creation is very orderly in Genesis chapter 1, right? It starts off the creating of light. We've got to separate the waters from the land. Everything kind of has its own place. God carves out a safe place for life to flourish. God then at the end says, let us create. God speaks in the first person plural for some reason in Genesis 1. Let us create humankind in our own image. And then it says male and female, God created them. The chapter understands gender kind of in this binary dualistic way, but it also describes both the first man and the first woman, both being created simultaneously in the image of God, or one might even say together, reflecting the image of God. Genesis 2 looks a little bit different. There are passages like this, or statements like this. The Lord God formed a man, literally an Adam. That's where the word Adam comes from, the Hebrew word for man. God formed a man of dust from the ground, literally from the Adamah. Right? Adam's name simply means dirt creature. Not anybody named Adam here. It's okay. It's literally what Adam means. And so as the first human, he's the creature made from the dirt. And the Lord God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. What differences do you notice in how God's characterized in these two things in terms of God's creative activity? Yeah, the comment from Katie was God's much more involved in the second story.
It's very intimate. That's very intimate.
It's very intimate. There's touching. After this, God's going to open Adam up and pull out a rib and fashion a woman from that as well, which is intrusive and intimate and I'd say gross, but the doctors in the room would be like, any surgeons in the room. But Betty over here. Oh, yeah.
Kathleen and then.
Well, I think the big difference is that, as you said, first, basically men and women were created very equal, and then in the second accounting, women were created as sort of an adjunct or offshoot of man.
Yeah, I should point out too when the story of Eve's creation comes because God brings all the animals to Adam, and Adam names them, which is interesting. That's kind of the job that God gives to Adam. And then it says, and I'm doing this by memory, I'm not going to quote it exactly right, that they discovered that there was no kind of fitting helper or no fitting partner for Adam out of all the animals. You just can imagine him sitting there like going, rhinoceros, like buffalo, you know. And the line is, it's not good for the man to be alone, right? It's not good for the human to be alone. And so there's something wrong or there's something defective about not being in community for this quote unquote dirt creature, right? For this man, for this different kind of thing in creation. And so the question then, it's been translated horribly as Eve becoming his helper or his helpmeet, I think is what the King James puts it, as if it's a subservient kind of partner, like you were saying as well. So there is that tinge of that going on in Genesis 2, which is why when people want to do a kind of male supremacy reading of the Bible, they always choose Genesis 2 instead of Genesis 1. That's true for New Testament. There's some New Testament authors who do that as well. But Betty.
So from Genesis 1 and to Genesis 2, what I see is that God has been on the outside, has been in what I describe as the universes, and was the universes, and was creating from the outside, and now he gets right onto the earth, and creates the bog man, Adam, and I mean, breathing air into his nostrils. I mean, that's just so hands-on now. So he's been hands-off to hands-on.
Yeah, we've got two real different views of a God in terms of God's connection to the creation as well, right? Betty.
So who wrote this stuff?
Yeah, who wrote this stuff?
Who came up with this imagery?
Well, that's a great question. Short answer, we don't know, if you're looking for a name. Longer answer, there are other creation myths from other ancient cultures that are nearby. And so one interesting thing is to compare and contrast how different cultures speak about a God who creates. Some of those myths, maybe the best known one, the Enuma Elish, you can Google it if you want to look it up, involves the slaying of a monster, right? God has to create through violence. Different story here. Genesis 1, God has to manage a chaotic thing, right? There's an earth that's void, there's waters covering everything. God has to create safe space out of this. Remember, this isn't, cosmology, this is myth. One of the theories goes that whoever the influence behind Genesis 1 is, looks to be somebody with more priestly sensibilities. What do priests like to do? We like order, right? Holy things, unholy things. Sacred places, profane places, right? The universe is navigable if you understand what's safe, what's dangerous, what God likes, what God doesn't like. They look at Genesis 1 and they say, this looks like something kind of out of a priestly mindset of a God who's off in a distance, right? Who's imposing order on an unruly world and trying to make it safe. Genesis 2 looks like it comes from voices that are much more interested in maybe a more earthy God, right? Or a God who is part of the creation that's described about being made. Maybe you remember the line in Genesis chapter 3, after they've eaten the fruit, God's walking in the garden in the cool of the morning. Remember that? And he wonders, where are the humans at? Right, this image of a God who goes for a walk in the garden in the cool of the morning. You never would find that in Genesis 1. Because I'm God. That's over there, I'm over here. So who wrote it? What it gets to is this idea that there are multiple visions of who God is and how God can be known woven through Genesis. which is one reason why sometimes stories might repeat. It's also a way in which it's a reminder that these origin stories are messy. They don't always all agree. And sometimes a nation, a people, a family carries multiple stories with them together to try to figure out who God is. That's as best I can do in terms of who might have written it in time. I'm pretty sure men wrote both of them. How about that as well, in terms of how God is foregrounded and God's depicted as male and how men play a bigger role. I mean, that's so. I've just cut half of the ancient population out of the equation for you. Oh, it's.
Because these first scriptures really form pretty much a universal theme about who God is in the world today.
Right.
This has stuck in our
Yeah.
lives.
Well, the comment is for folks online. These stories have stuck in terms of our understanding of who God is today, which is absolutely true. I mean, these are stories that are still quoted by some to keep women out of leadership in ministry, for example. We can go on, right? You probably have more of those stories than I do. Because of where they stand, right? Because of how important they are, because of fights in this country over creationism and Darwinism and things like that, these passages became a kind of like line in the sand, right? Do you love God and trust the Bible, or do you not? It comes down to how was the world created. I would hope that's less these stories' fault and maybe more our fault in terms of our culture, but it's a both and, I'm sure. I'm going to move on, if I can, just to get one more thing in under the wire here. Actually, two more things. When we move to Abram, to jump ahead a bit in this more particular story, I want to remind us all, Abram's 75 when God first says this. Now, Genesis talks about people living to 200 and crazy things like that. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know what that's about. But I do know that 75 is 75. And Abram as well is kind of like, are you really sure? And have you met Sarah? She's also, as they say, getting along in years. And the whole thing is kind of hilarious to both of them as they imagine this. And that's kind of an undercurrent in the story, too. Here's the original call. God shows up at multiple times and makes promises to Abram. But this is the first one. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. What a promise, right? Just go. I'll tell you when you're there, right? There's not, the end game is not all that, the end of this is not all of that clear. But God goes on, I'll make you of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So the calling here is, right, you're going to inherit these things, you're going to receive these things so that you will be a blessing. In other words, this is God's plan to bless the whole world. Right? This is where the story gets from very general to now very particular, where God says, within this family, I'm going to be known in some way, or I'm going to support this family in some way, so that they might be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. In other words, I'll be on your side. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is a passage New Testament authors come back to from time to time, especially the Apostle Paul, to point out the ways in which God is keeping this promise. So I just want to note that promise is a real big theme in Genesis. And to jump ahead to chapter 22, we have to do one uncanny story, or maybe we've already done a couple of them. This is the so-called binding of Isaac, or sometimes called the near sacrifice of Isaac, which we won't get to the bottom of. People have written whole books on this, wrestling with the moral implications of this. What's going on here theologically? What's this story all about? So let me just read it for us. After these things, God tested Abraham. Let's stop there. Why is God testing Abraham? Abraham has believed God on multiple times, done what God has told him to do. Why does God still feel the need to test him, right? Interesting that the narrator tells us at the outset, this is somehow some kind of a setup. God said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Notice that will be a refrain in this story. God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. I mean, this is horrific at any level. It's utterly confusing after chapter of God saying, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you a great nation, right? Isaac will be the one through whom the promise goes. Yet God does this. Abraham asks no questions, which is also curious. We should note that there were other nations, other religious movements in the ancient world that practiced child sacrifice regularly. It was not an uncommon thing, I think is fair to say, in parts of the ancient Near East. Part of this story might be a way of trying to set Abram and this new nation apart from that. But it's an interesting way of getting there, even if that's the case. It doesn't solve all of our problems. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Which is curious. Rabbis have been fussing over this story for centuries and aren't finished yet, just as Christians are fussing over this story. Interesting that Abraham says, "We will come back to you." Is this a sign that Abraham knows how this is going to end? Is he just kind of telling his enslaved people, like, don't worry about it. I might come, but just you stay here. You don't want to see what's going to happen. Or is this Abraham saying that he believes God's not going to have him go through with this? In other words, is Abraham already showing faith at this point in the story? Does Abraham already know who God is or know that God might be persuaded? Possibly. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. Isaac has to carry the wood for his own sacrifice, which is poignant and terrible all at once. The other thing that's interesting is Isaac appears not to be a small child at this point in the story. Abraham's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 years old, and he could be walking with a teenager. Which makes the story of how are you going to bind this kid and kill him on an altar even more interesting. In other words, what's Isaac's role in this story as well? Is Isaac aware of what's going on? How is Isaac participating? Like, is this also a test, so to speak, or maybe I should say instead, a moment where Isaac proves something about his own faith? Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Again, is this a line of faith, or is this Abraham just trying to simply say, let's just get this over with as quickly as possible? I think Abraham seems to be showing faith in the midst of the story. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Again, if Abraham's 100 years old and Isaac is a teen, this is not happening without Isaac's consent in some way, shape, or form. So what's Isaac's role in this? Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to kill his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Don't lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God." That's kind of the line, right? Now I know. Raises all sorts of questions. Does God not know this in any other way? Has Abraham not already proved this in other ways? Is the sheer fact that Abraham makes this journey part of this? Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. This is skipping ahead now some ways. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. The story doesn't end with any mention of Isaac, which is curious, right? It only says Abraham goes down from the mountain. It makes some people suspect that Abraham really killed Isaac there and somehow something got mixed up in the story. I think more likely this is a story about what makes Abraham and Isaac go their separate ways, right? When does Isaac know it's time to leave home? Perhaps that is here. Also, after this, Sarah dies. There's a way in which, not necessarily because of grief, but it's one of the next things that happens. It's a way in which this story becomes this pivot where Abraham now starts to recede. Sarah no longer is living, and Isaac will now carry the promise forward. In fact, you can see, this is Mark Chagall, a Jewish author, On the left-hand side, you see a woman by the tree there. Often Sarah is included in illustrations of this event. She's not mentioned in this story, but how is the story more poignant to have his mother there watching the two men do something that looks probably incredibly stupid from her point of view? You've also got Chagall draws Jesus carrying his own cross as well back there. Chagall was Jewish, but also includes a lot of Christian symbolism, knowing that Jesus was Jewish, and the angel there as well. There's nothing about this story that we can fix or explain away. It's a story about Abraham proving his faith. It's a story maybe about Isaac proving his faith. It might be a story about God proving God's trustworthiness. But the way they get there is really, really disturbing. It's one of these stories that I think might make more sense if we talk about how it comes out of a culture that suffered, again, tremendous loss, tremendous devastation, humiliation. Does that change the way in which the story might sound? People who have been forced to relocate and now coming home trying to build a nation, what does that look like? It's a hard story to read from a position of privilege and comfort, I think is part of what I'm trying to say. I don't know what it looks like to read it in other perspectives, but there's a certain mystery to this story that reminds us that no matter how present or loving or chummy or trustworthy God looks in parts of Genesis, something about God is still a little bit untamable, right? And a little bit wild. I think God changes throughout the story of the Old Testament, or maybe it's better to say people's perception of who God is and how God operates evolves as we work our way through Genesis and through Exodus. But at least at this point in the story, there's still something really fearful about this God whom Abraham is trusting, whom Abraham is following, but whom Abraham is also negotiating with from time to time. We'll see next week the story of Jacob wrestling with God as well. This idea of contending with God is something we see, I think, over and over again in the book of Genesis. And it's one of the things I really appreciate about it. And that's exploring the Older Testament. Tim, are you signaling me or do you have a question? Just 1 minute till the live stream. That's for the live streamers. You all can stay as long as you want. I'm happy to stick around if there are questions or comments. Sorry I didn't leave a little bit of time at the end, which I usually would want to do. But again, Margaret and I will be available on Wednesday as well. These are our origin stories, right? Sometimes our gods are a little wild. Sometimes our ancestors make decisions we don't quite get. And sometimes those origin stories get reworked and reinterpreted, and we find new things hidden in the cracks of them. That might be life-giving or might not. We can wrestle with all of these for weeks and weeks and weeks to come. But we didn't think you would come if we said we're just going to do an entire fall on Genesis 1 through 24. So we'll keep moving quickly. All right. Worship begins in 15 minutes. If you're heading that direction, I'll stick around if you